my honey, fare thee well. Well, the man I love was strong and tall. He moved his body like a cannonball.
It's been a long time in coming, this day has. I had planned to do this last spring, but other events in my life prevented me from doing that. So I didn't want to do this in the summer because I knew a lot of people would be traveling, and I didn't want to have conflicted schedules. So I waited until Keith's birthday week, which was last Monday, and he would have turned 76. And so I think it's a perfect time to celebrate his life during his birthday week, and I'm really glad all of you are here to celebrate it with all of us. And I just will say one funny thing, which is that many, many years ago, Keith and I were both talking about whether or not we would want a memorial if we died. We were both very healthy. I think we were probably in our 60s, and we were both saying, I don't know, would we want a memorial? And Keith said, you know, Deb, don't have a memorial for me. Nobody's going to want to come to my memorial. Yeah, well, I think today proves that one pretty wrong. So thank you all for that. I want to just point out some special thanks that are on the back of the program to the people who really helped with today in the past few months. Steve Rustad, who's in the center of the room here, videotaping this for people who could not be here, and that includes Keith's mom. She really wanted to be here, but she's too frail. Dan Mills, who is photographing, and I'm not sure where, there he is. Now, Steve was a creative director who hired Keith on a number of jobs long ago in the day when Keith was a commercial photographer, and Dan, the photographer, was one of Keith's assistants in the studio. So it's terrific that they've come in to help with all of this today. I want to thank our caterer, Classic Culinaire. You'll be enjoying their treats as soon as we finish the program. Kara's Cupcakes, you'll be enjoying their treats too. I want to thank Casey Cartwright and Diane Hesse for tremendous emotional and logistical support, and Casey for his musical support setting up the sound today, and also for the playlist that you'll hear in the background if the talking isn't too loud. I want to thank Al and Trish Hart, my neighbors on Tamalpais Road. They've just been a tremendous support for me over the past 8 months. They do everything from taking my garbage cans out on Tuesday night to popping over when I need something heavy carried out. And it's really tremendous help. Eric Waterud, who still walks Valentino, our dog, takes him up to the hills and gives him a really good walk. He's a tremendous canine companion and a stalwart friend of both Keith and mine. And also to Lisa and Eric, who came over this morning to help us bring everything over here that we needed to bring. All these photographs that you'll see, and the flowers, everything. So thank you to Eric and Lisa. A couple of late acknowledgments that aren't on the program. I want to thank Mike Madalena at Minuteman Press in Petaluma. He printed these beautiful programs gratis. I know that was through Steve's connection, but I definitely want to give him credit. I want to thank Lester Kaufman and Ellen Kahn for going wine shopping with me. They helped me pick out some wonderful wines for today. If you don't like them, you can talk to them, but I don't think you'll have any problem with the wines. I want to thank Bob Wax, who's up here in the front row, and he's going to sing a musical tribute in just a few minutes. And he's been practicing for a month or more, and believe me, you'll see, it's going to be spectacular. And then I want to thank finally Susan Dutton, my ally and sounding board, for today, helping me with today. Whenever I would say, does this sound like a good thing to eat? Should I order this hors d'oeuvre? What kind of wine? What do you think I should do about it? Do you think this is the right place? She's having an event tomorrow. I was having this event today. And we worked together on it. It was really helpful to have someone to be a sounding board. So thanks to all of those people. And if I've forgotten one of you, I really apologize. I thank everyone who's helped me over the last number of months. The next thing I want to do, make sure I get this in the right order. So I want to read a letter that Steve wrote to his father. He was about 38 years old when he wrote this. I only recently found this letter when we were going through photographs. I was going through photographs with Vincent and Grace at the house. And there were things besides photographs in the box, some letters, some journals, some different things. And I read this letter and I thought it was so moving. And then it occurred to me that it would be perfect to read today. So He wrote this to his father when his father had returned from Florida to visit some relatives after another relative had died. I'm not sure who the relative was who died. I don't think it was immediate family, but anyway, the letter speaks for itself. Dear Pop, and he wrote it on his commercial stationery, Keith Silva Photography. Dear Pop, welcome back from Florida. You must be rather tired and probably distraught. I wanted to write and tell you my support for you in this time. As you get older yourself and see family die, it must make you feel your own mortality. That can't be a real encouraging thought. It's moments like this when we are all made more aware of just how short, fragile, and fleeting life is. It seems so important to make every moment as special and fulfilled as we can. Those moments that pass by each and every second simply do not get replaced. Time is the one commodity of which there is never any more made. I think deaths of any person, but especially family and close friends, really emphasize the dearness and wonder of the entire life process. It's really a special moment that we all have for each other and ourselves. I've been real encouraged to see, for instance, how well you and Mom are getting along in your retirement years. You've both worked so long and hard and so very thoroughly and successfully to raise the family and do your work. You've both really participated in the events and people around you. That is truly wonderful and special. As these next years continue it seems even more important to consciously take care of yourselves and each other. Your psychic and physical health is so very important. It's important to nourish the love and specialness that you and Mom have between you. Your next years will go quickly, and it will be important to be in them, capitalized, as constructively and completely as possible. I think it is very important how we die. I've been giving that quite a bit of thought lately. In other words, how will I die? Not physically, but psychically. What kind of shape will my head, heart, soul be in? I think it's important to die contented, fulfilled, and at peace with oneself, which includes, amongst other things, being at peace with those around us, family, friends, etc. So these are things we can learn from another's passing, i.e., the meaning and hopes and fears of our own lives, including thoughts and the beginnings of inquiries into our own deaths. Welcome home, Pop. Keith. Thank you, Keith, for this reminder today. Now I'd like to ask Bob to come up and sing a special song for Keith.
Deborah, take this song for me. It's called Dinks, old American classic song. If I had wings like Noah's dove, I'd fly up the river to the one I love. Fare thee well, my honey, fare thee well. Well, the man I love was strong and tall. He moved his body like a cannonball. Fare thee well, oh my honey, fare thee well. I remember one evening in the pouring rain, and in my heart was an aching pain. Fare thee well, my honey, fare thee well. Well, the muddy river runs muddy and wild. You can't give a bloody for my unborn child. Fare thee well, oh my honey, fare thee well. So as to show us a bird flying high above, like they were living without the one you love. Fare thee well, oh my honey, fare thee well. One of these mornings won't be long, you'll call my name and I'll be gone. Fare thee well, my honey, fare thee well. Fare thee well, oh my honey, fare thee well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Now I'd like to call Eric Waterett up to say a few words about Keith.
We are here to celebrate a life well lived. Each of us had our own deeply personal relationship with Keith because Keith was not afraid to go deep. If you connected with Keith, it was a lifetime relationship. He was always ready to check in and remembered exactly where the last conversation left off. My name is Eric Waterett, and I have the honor of being Keith's good friend for over 50 years. Our friendship grew as we both passed through the various stages of life, and I only realize now how much I miss Keith, because as the summer passed, we had not embarked on some annual misadventure. I first met Keith through the Teacher Corps program, not long after we both graduated from college. We were assigned to the same junior high school in the community of Salinas, California. During our one-year internship, we were expected to become excellent teachers, skilled enough to take our wisdom to the Peace Corps and be teacher trainers. Teaching in a middle school program that left lots of latitude for student success, there were many gaps in our expertise. Keith used some of his time in Salinas to hone his photography skills in the school's darkroom. His teaching career almost came to an early end when racy boudoir photographs were discovered by one of our students. At the end of our Teacher Corps year, Keith headed halfway around the world to Malaysia with the Peace Corps crew, and I stayed stateside. In the midst of the language intensive, he decided that the Peace Corps was not for him. He took the opportunity to continue his trip around the world with stops in India, Pakistan, and finally London, where he drove a cab until he was able to get an internship with a professional photographer who gave him the skills that he would need for his lifelong passion and career. Through the luck of the universe, Keith and I found each other again when we both landed in Marin. Keith became a confidant and a dependable friend. When my first wife, Susan, was diagnosed with lymphoma, the first phone call I made from the bank of hospital payphones was not to her parents, her sisters, or my parents, but to Keith. I knew full well that his support and concern would be essential in the coming days and months. It is worth noting that prior to Keith's own diagnosis, last November, he was dedicated completely to supporting Deb through her battle with breast cancer. My summers off from teaching and Keith's flexible schedule allowed for many road trip adventures. He was a great traveling companion. On the road, he would engage me with the latest research on the physics of subatomic particles from a book that he had just finished. And he was sure that I could add to the discussion. After all, I taught 7th grade science. If the topic was climate change, he would start a calculation of the carbon emissions our day's trip was producing. He was a fantastic estimator. He was well versed on the Pacific bubble, rising ocean temperatures, and the pending El Nino. Our adventures took us to the depths of Badwater, Death Valley, to the heights of Wheeler Peak and Great Basin National Park. We never spoke much about religion, but the closest we ever came to being in church together was in the middle of a bristlecone pine grove at 10,000 feet. We drove the extraterrestrial highway late into the night, dodging range cattle that seemed to appear out of nowhere. And we chased down red lights that suddenly and inexplicably disappeared out of sight. Our shared love of mountain biking took us to steep mountain trails and red desert roads. Keith was particularly fond of the stark beauty of the latter. Keith loved the wildness of our planet and the mysteries of the universe beyond. If a storm had knocked out power to half of Marin and the wind-driven waves were pounding the coast, we would gear up, head to the Stinson Cliffs, and cling to the rocks for the full effect. If the best view of an approaching comet or meteor shower required the darkest skies, we would head to the high desert on the far side of the Sierra and camp far from any artificial light. To view the solar eclipse of 2017, we drove to the eastern Oregon and slept in a farmer's field directly in the line of totality. And certainly, we would have spent this morning somewhere in the middle of Nevada to take in today's annular eclipse. I have a little story off the record just to tell you about something that Keith asked me to do one time. He called, I was living out on the coast, and he called from the studio on Clementina and said, "Eric, you've got to come over and help me with a photo shoot." And he'd never done that before, so I figured it must have been important. He was doing a photograph for the outdoor company Sierra Designs. And so I headed over, and when I got there, he was standing in his studio, and in the middle of the floor was a pile of blue and gray nylon and any number of short fiberglass rods. He said, "Eric, this is a tent. I haven't been able to get it together, and you've got to help me." I said, "Well, where are the instructions?" And he said, "That's us." So apparently he had to make the photographs for the building of this thing. He did have a small sheet of paper with some sketches on it that were from some designer, very minimal. There was a picture of a fiberglass rod going into a little aluminum slot. There was a picture of a triangle, and then there was finally a rough sketch of something that looked like a Buckminster Fuller igloo. So that would be sort of like following instructions going from A to D to Z. Well, we thought it out, we sorted out the sticks, we finally got it together, maybe in 20 minutes or so. We took it apart, put it back together again. And in the end, Keith got his photographs, and I got the tent. We took it on a camping trip. I believe it was Snake River between Oregon and Idaho. And I put up the tent. We had the campfire, ready for bed. I went into the tent, and Keith, as he always did, took his tarp and his sleeping bag and wandered out into the sagebrush, found a spot, laid down, and went to sleep counting the shooting stars. Anytime we were stopped by a flag person on a lonely highway, Keith would get out of the car to find out how long the delay might be. He came back 20 minutes later with the full life story of a highway worker who spent his summers on the road, living in cheap hotels, while his wife, 3 kids, and a dog held down the fort in a small town that was halfway between anywhere. Keith's curiosity and interview skills were legendary. My wife recalls sitting next to him at our introductory dinner and telling me later that Keith already knows more about her than I ever will. My son Brad was always a good sport when Keith joined us on camping or backpacking trips, responding to Keith's inquisitive queries with more than monosyllabic replies. Keith never enjoyed the pleasures of parenthood. In fact, he would be the first to admit that fatherhood would have been a dicey proposition. He did, however, feel intimately connected to the lives of Zach, Josh, Reed, and Brad, the sons of his dear friends, Jeannie, Allie and Sabin, Lynn and Adrian, and myself. He may have come across as a crazy uncle sometimes, but his love and interest were genuine. Keith took the first photo of newborn Brad in the hospital room with a Polaroid that he carried with him at the time. And he delighted to be in attendance at his wedding 28 years later. Keith was an artist. It showed in his commercial work and his experimental photo and color studies once he retired. Keith actually showed me there were multiple adjustments on my iPhone that could take my typical postcard scene and turn it into something electric and amazing. Keith never left a photo untouched. Many of us likely recall the notes that Keith would give us with his characteristic day-glow highlighter emphasis. Keith was a lover of galleries and their openings, and to accompany him to either was eye-opening. He would locate and engage the artist or curator with the most detailed conversations about motives and process. Last week on Keith's birthday, my wife, our friend Mimi, and I visited the Pier 24 Photography Gallery in San Francisco, one of his favorites. When I mentioned to the gallery director, Chris McCall, that I was a friend of Keith Silva, he lit up. He was effusive in praise for Keith, not only in what he did to support the gallery when the Port of San Francisco was trying to take their space away, but also that Keith was the first on the list to be invited when any new show was being set. His presence, participation, and engagement were to be missed. Keith never had a gallery opening of his own, but we should all take time today to view Keith's art that surrounds us in this, his first public show. Keith was a true Fairfaxian. Many of you from Fairfax know him as a man about town. He and this town were made for each other. When Keith walked the streets with his dog, he was checking in on all that was happening in the community. Not too many people can say that they were shopping at the Good Earth when it was a storefront on Bolinas Avenue. It was community that Keith loved, be it Burning Man or a cluster of related friends he held dear. And it is his community that brings us together today to celebrate a life well lived. I'd like to invite Jeannie Werner to the front.
As I said, I've got things to say and I want Keith to hear every word. I also want to explain why I'm wearing this silly skirt. For the first time, I'm wearing a skirt for the first time in many years. Written on it are 2 phrases. The first is, life is beautiful. Appreciate each moment. And that speaks a lot to me about Keith. Doesn't that speak to you about Keith? I've known Keith since 1986, and I'm going to speak about him as a man, as a friend, as an uncle, and as family. First, how was Keith in this world? He was a seeker. Honestly, in early times, he seemed to float a little out there, not quite readable, but seeing things with both his eyes and his heart that others weren't so quick to see. He was deeply spiritual. He loved every corner of this earthly paradise he visited. In my opinion, he almost completely underestimated himself, his own worth, and was modest and self-effacing to a fault. He was an artist with his camera, and because of that, allowed us to see a little of what he was seeing, the essence and beauty of everything around him. The phrase, "not a mean bone in his body," could have been invented for Keith. He was without guile. He had a gazillion questions about life and found many answers. Have I made of him a saint? That is not my intention. He was completely decent, loving, very loving human being. Keith the friend. Our romance was short-lived and quickly developed into a bromance, if that's the right word, which flourished. As a friend, he was steady, sensitive, and always had my back. He shared Deb, his love of his life, generously in friendship. He was quick to spot trouble and quick to set about fixing it. He believed that it was both important and possible. He was hurt and disappointed when his love was not returned in full, when he was not seen for his loyal and steadfast self, but he was quick to forgive, quite stubborn, in fact, about making things right. He was a very important part of my life. I want to speak a little bit about Keith the uncle and kind of latch on to what Eric was saying. Keith was an uncle without equal to my son, Zach. He loved Zach without conditions, in easy times and in times he found it more challenging. Zach and I were lucky to share lots of time from Zach's earliest years and adventures with Keith. And it's a laundry list: trips to Lassen, Pacific Grove, the Sierras, Yosemite, and a famous one to Death Valley, where Zach and I fled to our car to escape a dust storm, and Keith hunkered down in his tent. We saw Halley's Comet in the desert sky. We did holidays, the boys' chorus, the soccer games, piano recitals, the Oakland A's, Marin County hikes and beaches, Christmas in Belt, Montana, the ranch in Carmel, mountain biking, that wasn't me, that was them, and photo shoots, and just hanging out in Berkeley and Fairfax. We shared lots of life experiences with Uncle Keith. The three of us were a happy band. Keith officiated at Zach's Rose Garden pre-wedding ceremony in Portland, an acknowledgement of his significance in Zach's life. He talked about this relationship, as he did about the relationships with the children of his other friends, as his lucky opportunity to experience raising a child, and left those children with a lot of history and love. So that's Keith, the man, the friend, and the uncle. The second thing written on my skirt in French is that families are important. That's clear today as we celebrate Keith's life in the presence of his family and extended family. I come to Keith and Deb as part of a family we have chosen. We've chosen each other as family, and I love them deeply. Keith loved Deb wholeheartedly, and I can't speak about Keith without speaking about Deb. He was so very happy to have found her, shared her life, and married her. Truly the love of his life. I can't celebrate his life without celebrating her. I've missed them dearly in my daily life since I've moved to Montana, but my friendship with them is so strong. I say it in the present because that's where it will always be for me. I'll never let go of them. These words of Polonius and Hamlet capture the essence of how I feel about these two. Those friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel. Deb, we are bound by hoops of steel.
First of all, Deb, I want to thank you for this warm-hearted memorial to Keith. And like others before me, I'm going to read from this script because to try to do it extemporaneously would be a little too tough.
Can you just speak a bit louder?
Yeah, sorry. Let me blast it. Sometimes I'm criticized for speaking too loudly. I'll try to hit the middle somewhere. How's this?
Good.
Thank you. I feel very lucky that my life intertwined with Keith's. He and I shared some memorable moments. He was my best man for not one, but two of my 3 weddings, including the wedding to my wonderful wife, Lynn, who became a close friend of Keith. He doubled as a photographer at another wedding. He accepted the task with some reluctance, as I learned that a professional ad photographer doesn't do wedding shoots. He was present at the hospital room the morning after our son Reed was born. An indelible memory. He took photos he entitled Day One. Before together, we headed off to Noah's and Pete's for coffee and bagels to bring back to our hotel room, our hospital room rather. I remember walking back with Keith, so joyous that I wasn't sure my feet were touching the ground. A moment. Now to the beginning of my memories of Keith and my relationship. I promise it won't take very long. I want to share some of my glimpses of his colorful life. I met Keith about 30 years ago, well subordinate to yours, Eric, in the backyard of Allie's home in Sacramento. I was about to graduate from law school and begin a job in San Francisco. I needed a place to stay while I drew my first few paychecks and found a place to rent. In his usual generous way, Keith offered me that place. It was his bachelor pad, a cool photography live-work studio in Soma. I was pretty excited to be in a location where I hoped I would see gorgeous models and party with the advertising crowd I was sure he must be hanging out with, coming out of law school and 3 years of study. Well, the models proved to be luggage, ketchup, and other consumer products, rather than ladies. And the parties proved to be non-existent as well, at least as far as I was concerned. These several weeks would be my first experience with Keith's near obsession for keeping his various relationships and activities separate from each other. With rare exception, a friend should not expect to meet his other friends or family members. We found ourselves in separate silos, populated by category: professional acquaintances, biking friends, let's see, where am I here? Yeah, partying friends, who included his dentist, who had access to laughing gas, known to be helpful for enlivening office parties. I was very pleased to be counted among his friends, no matter what silo I found myself. In conversations, Keith had an endearing habit of focusing nearly all of his attention on you, asking you a string of questions, but never seeming to allow any time for inquiring about his day, his week, his life. He traveled a fair amount, sometimes to dry western BLM lands, transporting his large containers of water and his beloved dog Spencer, or to far-off places such as Bali, where he had long before worked with the Peace Corps, I thought. On that trip, he boxed his bike up to tour the island and met a Komodo dragon, which treated him for quite a long time. I think he surprised himself that he could climb a tree. He lived for encounters like that, but we would only catch smatterings of information about his adventures when he returned. Ironically, given his profession, we seldom saw many photographs of these trips. He He was an interesting and perplexing combination of someone who enjoyed being invited and mixing with other people while exuding his vibrant personality. Those that met him remembered their encounters. He deflected most questions as to what he was doing and how he felt about things, preferring instead to probe others about their lives. Who was this international man of mystery? In college at Berkeley, Keith had been accepted into the prestigious law school, but he chose a path in the arts instead. A wise choice. But you can imagine for a moment Keith as a trial lawyer, cross-examining eyewitness in a murder trial. So, Miss Brown, you say you saw the accused break into the residence of the deceased on the night of November 4th. But I have to ask you, Miss Brown, did you think that the accused, my client, was really sexy as he jimmied the front door lock? Keith was a necessary fixture at Reed's graduations and at our house parties. At our annual Christmas eggnog and pastry parties, he likely consumed the caloric intake of the 49ers front line. On a camping trip together in Sabin, we pitched a tent as rain was in the forecast. Here's the tent theme again. Keith naturally chose to sleep outside the tent. Yes, it rained that night, but he didn't care. He was thrilled by a visit from a large bear that sniffed him in a sleeping bag as it foraged for a meal. Luckily, didn't find him to be that subject. Keith was a philosopher at heart, and we, often with Thomas, would toss around ideas about where humankind had come from and where it was headed. Before Keith and Deb were wed, David, Thomas, Peter, and I were able to coax Keith into a quote-unquote bachelor party. The event turned out to be Keith's style. Although he might have appreciated an exotic dancer popping out of a large gift wrap box, instead, we hiked on the bluffs above Muir Beach and lunched at the nearby Pelican Inn while talking about his upcoming nuptials. I don't think I ever saw him happier than that day as he related how life was so good now and how it would be even better now he was finally getting married to a sweetheart. Unfortunately, that joyous day was only about 2 years ago. Keith's cancer cruelly cut short his marriage, but fortunately Deb had entered into his life more than 20 years before. He had found deep love. He was feeling more comfortable about revealing his inner self to those who cared about him. I only wish he could have stayed with us a lot longer to share more experiences. I have one final reflection. Given Keith's holistic view of the universe and his place within it, don't you think he really enjoyed today's solar eclipse? On the day of his memorial, with his atoms mixing comfortably with the atoms of the rest of the universe.
I want to acknowledge Deb's own bosses right now in her own family, her two sisters, and what an extraordinary time for you. So I am the youngest in the Silva family. Keith was the oldest. And growing up, I really felt like I didn't even know Keith. When I was 7 years old, Keith was taking off to college. He was taking off to the teacher corps. He was taking off to Malaysia. He was taking off to London. And when he would come back and visit, he did an odd little thing. He would say, "Big Sam the Monkey Man." He would pick me up and yell out, "Big Sam the Monkey Man." I have no idea what that meant. I asked him once, what did that mean? He didn't even remember ever saying that to me, but it is a very vivid memory for me, and probably the only strongest memory I have of this mysterious man, my brother Keith, until I was in my late teens. And Keith purchased his home in Fairfax, and I had a car. And I would come, and I would spend many, many long weekends here in Fairfax with Keith. And for me, that was when Keith and I became friends, became family, learned about each other. Like what a couple of you have said, he asked lots of questions and wasn't always quick at sharing of his self, so you had to be an observer. I was fortunate to be able to go to his studio and watch a couple of his photo shoots, but mostly I watched him here in Fairfax, and I would watch him in his kitchen. And as many in my family who are here today can tell you, there were some very adventurous meals we would all enjoy in his kitchen. I don't know how many of you were able to enjoy a sparolini meal. I think that was something he got from a photo shoot. There was one infamous meal that we had where he kept the pilot light on in his oven, and I think it was a turkey, and it was coated in sparolini, and everybody in the family, but I think myself and maybe my mother, ate it. The rest said, nope, no way, not eating it. I would walk through Fairfax with him as he would rummage through people's garbage and then bring home these fabulous finds and create some amazing garden art. His love of Spencer. Spencer was a dog I was far more intimate with than I was with Dino, but walking up in the hills with Spencer and Keith. And probably the most frightening memory for me with Keith is him climbing in the big fig tree outside of his breakfast nook window, barefoot, no gloves, crazy dull saw, and hearing him exclaim when he had done a big, major, awful cut. Oh, well, that's all right. It'll mend itself. I'm not going to worry about it. Since Keith's passing, I've had some amazing, strong moments with him that have been art-related. So to see his work back behind us here and to have spent that time with you, Deb, and David, and Vincent in those last couple of days with Keith and see all of his artwork on the walls, I have to say that I regret not having acknowledged Keith as an artist. And I think that it's a difficult thing when somebody does it in their profession and it's something that they love and that they're passionate about and that they're good at, but we forget to say you're also an artist. And that's what I think we're seeing here with the work. And that's what I felt. I felt it when Ray and I were in Washington, D.C. in the spring, and we went through a Laurie Anderson show, and I texted you, Deb, and told you about it. I felt it when we were at the DeYoung Museum for the Ansel Adams show, but I felt so connected to Keith by other photographers there in that show, not just the Ansel Adams work. And then recently, Ray and I were in Portugal, and a couple of days before we left Portugal, Porto has a museum of photography, and it's an old prison. And in this area of this museum, it's filled with old cameras. And it is rooms and rooms of cameras. And we Silvas were fortunate to have a father who didn't have a lot of money, but they had this camera. I don't know what happened to this camera, but my father was always good at making sure there were photographs of us kids. And I've been fortunate that I'm married to a photographer and that I had a brother who was a photographer. And in that room just a couple of days ago, I felt such a strong connection with Keith, with the blessings that I've had in having this family connection of photography. And it was a true gift that lives with me. Deb had suggested that I speak to you about a camping trip Keith and I had a couple years ago. So it's been fun to listen to Eric and David talk about their adventures out in the wild. We went to Lassen, and Lassen Volcanic National Park has a very special place in our family. My parents served for 10 years as volunteers, which means my mother worked like 8 to 10 hours a day, and my dad kind of wandered around and did the Keith thing, talking lots of questions. And we would go to Lassen. So that Lassen is a very dear place. We would visit my parents during those 10 summers that they volunteered. So Keith and I in 2018 did a camping trip in Lassen. And there was a moment in the camping trip where we had taken off on this trail. We had identified the trail we were going to do earlier in the day, and we came to a fork. And Keith said, well, how about if instead we don't do what we were planning on doing? We'll take this trail, which was much, much longer. And then I'll come out to the road, and you'll stay on the road, and then I'll hitchhike back to the truck, and then I'll come back and get you. What do you think? Well, as a couple of you have spoken about, Keith had a way of sort of like getting on you and just kind of saying, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And my interaction often with Keith would be just shutting down and stressing and going, no, 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 no. But Keith looked at me and said, what would Ray say? What would Ray say right now at this moment? And I said, Ray would tell us to stay on the trail we had planned because we had enough food and enough water and enough energy to come back to the car. And we stayed on that trail. And I have with me on my cell phone, this beautiful, magical moment when we came to the end of that trail. There was nobody else with us. We were at this like lake with these pollywogs and these little frogs bouncing around our feet. And in the video, there's a moment where Keith is walking ahead of me, and he's got his walking sticks, and he's quiet, and you just hear our feet on the trail. And I watched that this morning, and it just brings me back to Keith so many times. So also on that camping trip, Keith convinced me to get out of my warm sleeping bag and go up to the high point of the road where the base of Mount Lassen is, where there was going to be the full moon rising. And I have this video of the moon rising, and I can hear Keith in the background asking these photographers who had brought thousands of dollars worth of equipment with them. And Keith is asking them questions about the equipment that they brought. And at one point in the video, you can hear a man telling Keith, I should have brought my bigger camera. And Keith's reply is, oh well, there will be other moments. And this morning I looked at an email response that Keith and I had back in 2018 when we had watched that video together. And Keith's response is, there will always be other moments. And that is really good news. So everybody take with you that special moment, that other moment with Keith, and be blessed that we all had them.
Hello, I'm David Campbell, speaking too loud. I was going to say a few words about Keith and me. And it's funny, as I listen to the stories that everybody's telling, he made me feel so special by spending time hiking and camping and mountain biking all around the West. And I thought I was the only one. That's how special Keith could make you feel. I want to tell a story about disappearing Keith. We often had mountain bike rides of half a dozen to a dozen riders all around Mount Tam area, and we would meet up at various locations to start, and we would roll 300 or 400 yards, and everyone would look around and say, where's Keith? And we might not see him all day long, but he knew the route. He knew where we were going. And every once in a while, he would like dart in from the side, and there he was for a moment. And then he was gone again. So he had this way of being like an Indian, just sneaking up on you. And you never know when he was going to appear again. We'd finish the ride, and we'd all be sitting around, maybe having a beer, and then he would come riding up, and we would start to quiz him. Where have you been, Keith? What's going on? And he was always very aloof about it. Maybe he was actually off with Eric or Adrian on a little interlude here or there. But we always called him Disappearing Keith. As Adrian talked about it, Keith was the best listener. He had this way of bringing you out, of asking questions, of making you feel special. And the more and more it happened to me, I began to realize what a great skill it was. And I began to copy it myself and use it because it's a great way to train yourself to listen. And listening is a tremendous skill that most of us don't know anything about. We just really want to talk. He was a great listener, one of the best. He was also what I call the voicemail king. I don't know if you all ever received voicemails from Keith. If you actually answered the phone when he called, he kind of sounded disappointed, as if he wanted you to hang up so he could just talk to your voicemail. He would leave these long, rambling voicemails talking about how wonderful you were, how much he appreciated you being in his life, how special you were, what a credit you were to humanity. And he would always close with that signature, ciao. Those voicemails were something else. Well, Keith, I want to leave you a voicemail. You were one of the best things that ever happened to me. You were special, kind, sincere, honest, loving. I miss you and I think of you every day and still can't believe that in a poof, you're gone. But time marches on. This is the life we lead. I want to close with just a paragraph from a Cormac McCarthy novel, Cities of the Plain, that I always found kind of poignant about life. Every man's death is a standing in for every other. And since death comes to all, there is no way to abate the fear of it except to love that man who stands for us. We are not waiting for his history to be written. He passed here long ago. That man who is all men and who stands in the dock for us until our own time come, and we must stand for him. Do you love him, that man? Will you honor the path he has taken? Will you listen to his tale? Allison comes up.
Does anyone need a little stretch? Does anyone want to stand? Okay, stand up for a minute. And stretch. I know I was, okay. Okay, you guys. Wonderful. Yeah. And greet the person next to you. But don't leave. Young man, my son. I've lost my son. Yeah, fresh air. Oh, okay, you guys. This is great. I know. Yeah, listen, down like this. Oh, okay. All right, you guys. Ready to sit down? We'll continue this. Are you ready to sit down? I guess not. Okay.
I didn't even know I owned it.
Okay, you all, are you ready?
Sit down.
I know, really, it's herding cats. Herding cats, okay. My name's Allison Phelps, and I met Keith in 1980, no, what year? 76, when he just returned from England. And when Deb asked if I wanted to speak, all I did was cry. And I called her and I said, I really want to be able to say yes, but I don't know if I can do it. and she said, I feel the same, but I want to honor Keith. So I thought, okay, this is about Keith. It's not about me and my sadness. So that doesn't make it any easier. So I'm going to start with why he was the most annoying friend I ever had in my life. I can't believe he was a friend for 47 years. And some of you who knew him before Deb, who kind of civilized him a little bit, he would never commit to an invite. He put you off to the very last minute, and then if he said yes, you knew something better did not come up. It's like, what kind of friend is that? You know, and the other thing Adrian referenced, he compartmentalized all of us. I mean, for years, I got to meet Eric early on because he was West Marin, like we were from Stinson, but otherwise we didn't know people until an ex threw a 50th surprise birthday for him. I mean, talk about your worst nightmare. We all came together and we got to compare notes. He saw us out there talking to each other, and it's like, he's like, oh my God, what are they saying? What stories are they sharing? He really needed some tweaking with his social skills. And Lynn and I took that on as an endeavor. We would tell him when it was appropriate to wear clothes, when it was appropriate to eat with a fork, you know, and not all the fingers. All this was a little Greek to him, so we had to be patient. I had a friend who ran into he and Deb a couple years ago down in Santa Barbara, and my friend from Ashland, where we're living now, wrote and said, oh my God, I can't believe it, I met your friend Keith. And I had this panic attack. I thought, oh my God, did he interrogate you? Are you still okay with us being friends, you know? I was always afraid to turn him loose on some of our friends. So sometimes my husband and I would say, why on earth is he our friend? And some of it we've talked about today. He was the most unique friend, most curious, most interesting friend, it makes me cry, I ever had. And when I met him, he came to visit my boyfriend at the time, who was a high school classmate of him. His name was Terry Mallory. So Keith came to visit us. And in those courtship days, you've got this pro and con list, you know? Well, I gave that man, Terry Mallory, a pro for having interesting friends. I thought, oh, great. I'm going to meet more interesting people, which I did later, a couple years later with Adrian. So he was the most loyal. I mean, look at all these people we've known. He's been committed to for 50 years, if not more. And I recognize so many of you all. And all of you are here because Keith impacted you. So I was fortunate to know his family, Gracie, Vince, his parents, the house he grew up in. Adrian, Keith, Saber and I, and Lynn, we attended his father's memorial in Monterey. So there aren't words for some of this, of what a 47-year friendship means. So I put together a storyboard that spells it out. And you'll see so much overlap, of course, with Adrian and Lynn, because they were just the pillars in my life. Keith and Adrian came together always. And there's this invisible line where close friends who've shared history and love and chapters and struggles, when they become family. And Keith was family.
So I'm in a room with 50 people who all knew Keith much better than I did. But I did know him a long time. I first met Keith in 1978 when he was just starting his career as a San Francisco photographer, and I was just beginning as a San Francisco art director. That was at Botsford Ketchum, for those of you in the industry that remember some of the older agencies. My last professional job with Keith was in 2000, so we worked together pretty continually for that period of time. I followed Keith through his photography journey, but I knew almost nothing about his personal life. And Keith, of course, knew everything about my personal life. A couple of the things that you pointed out was how much he was fond of your children. My son went into the Army, and he started his Army career at the Defense Language Institute, and Keith just could not, that just knocked him out. Keith was always interested in my son's journey. He would always ask about my son Ethan. We shot a lot of different kinds of projects. The most memorable project we shot was for an assignment where the working title was describing what up to your ass and alligators look like. Keith rented 2 crocodiles, live crocodiles. So we were in his studio with a 3-foot and a 5-foot crocodile. We shot in perspective so they would be about the same size with a crocodile wrangler. They were very docile. I mean, they looked ferocious, and it turns out they look their most ferocious when they're yawning because they're sleepy. Keith was always extremely imaginative, and I never lost sight of the fact that he was an artist. I did one assignment for a company called George Litho. We'd come up with this idea of an album, and I wanted to feature 5 unique photographers from San Francisco, and Keith was one of them. There were, but the photographers were all different kinds of genres. Keith chose to shoot the assignment on Polaroid negative film. So it got the most interesting color. Keith was always experimenting. I always loved Keith's approach to photography, and early on he asked me if I would help him market his work. And you know, again, the San Francisco photography market was really crowded, and lots of you, a couple of you are here, very talented people. So how best to try and communicate the fact that Keith was different and brought a different perspective? And so the marketing title of that campaign, which ran for a couple of years, I think, was Imported from California. And it really did, I can't take credit for a lot of creative genius, but the idea behind it was it really did capture the fact that what Keith brought was unusual. I'll tell you one final story. Someone was asking me why I left the advertising business, and I left it with remnants of my sanity and the fact that I had not become addicted to any controlled substance. Not true of most of my peers. But it was a very difficult environment, and at one point I had I had a mental breakdown on the job. So who showed up to drive me home? Keith. So when you talk about someone who was, in the parlance of the day, he was there for you. Keith was always there for me. Thank you very much.
Before I invite our last speaker up, I just want to mention that Steve is responsible for the beautiful invitations that went out. He designed them, as well as today's program. And now I'd like to invite David Silva up.
Hi. So don't worry, we're almost done. 2 people who were supposed to be here today that were close to Keith but weren't able to come, but Deb asked them to write something that they would have said if they were here, and she asked me to read those remarks. So the first one is from Doug Struber. And turns out I actually knew Doug Struber in high school. He was a senior, I was a sophomore, and we were both on the tennis team. But he had to send me the picture of the yearbook to remind me that I knew him. Doug says, Keith was one of my best friends in high school. Our friendship continued when we grew out of adolescence and went off to college. We had some good adventures in Southern California, the Bay Area, and Arizona over the years. Keith was one of the few high school friends with whom I never lost touch. In retirement years, we had extended phone calls every few years to, quote, solve the world's problems, unquote. Keith had such a gregarious spirit, always inquisitive about those he met and making them feel like they really mattered. I always admired that about him. He had a real flair for living. The best compliment I can make is to say Keith made a difference in my life. And the other person is Gail Richter, who lives in Ashland, Oregon, and a friend of Deb's. Deb has known since college. Keith transformed a quotidian yard, I had to work on that one for a while to make sure I wasn't going to trip up. Keith transformed a quotidian yard into a phantasmagorical paradise. I think you all probably know that yard. His vulnerability opened the door for mine. Keith convinced me to grok my shrink's background, saying, quote, take no mystery man's counsel. When Deb bought Keith extravagant shirts, he loved to dress up. His photographs transported me to a lovely, sharp, pulsating land. Deb and Keith made music together, counterpoints. He sees us, and he is smiling.
Now, I'd like to make room for anyone in the audience who wants to come up and say something. Feel free to do so. Stefan.
Yes. Hello, hi, my name is Stefan Kirkeby, and I've been a really good friend of Keith's, and I think Keith's been a really good friend of mine, and I miss him. And I've been here in Marin County for like 25 years, and most of the time I've known Keith here at a gallery, art gallery, and a big thing going on here in Marin County, and he was a major figure. He always seemed to know what was going on before I knew it. And he was on top of everything, every photographer, every artist, and my focus in life has been photography. And I've never known anyone so passionate and so loving and caring for, you know, the medium and the aesthetics. There was tremendous trust you built up with Keith, and I'm sure that's with everybody in here. It's just this incredible kind of exchange of understanding, and it was all about, like, you know, you'd sit, he'd come and just hang out, we'd just hang out together, and it was just natural. He'd just show up, he'd never tell you he's coming by or whatever, he'd just show up, and we'd spend hours and hours and years talking, and he always had such different insight, different perspectives. And like, I'd be like, you know, I'd be all, this person or that person's awesome. He'd always say, you know, he'd always show a better positive side towards it. Like, he'd always say, oh, no, you gotta look at this artist in this way. And then I said, really, you think? He said, yeah. So he opened my eyes. And I miss that guy. And it's like the biggest problem in my life right now is missing him. I ran into Deb the other day, and I'm just like, oh my God. I thought I had problems. I don't have any problems. I have no problems. My biggest problem is missing Keith. You know? So, it's a huge loss. And, it's just someone I'll miss every day. And, I didn't get a chance to look at his photography. And I'm so glad because he's like, you know, he's the most modest person in the world. He never told anybody that he ever did anything outrageous in life, but he was an outrageously talented person. And he's always talked about the other and always cared about making things right with everybody. And he'd always find out, like, you know, I didn't know much about him as much, but he knew everything about me. And it was so nice, and we just spent a long time, hours and hours talking. And it was just so kind, and when I found out he was gone, it was just, it's still too much. And I share all the passion that he had in this room with all of you. And I never thought I'd be so heart-struck by a person in my life, but Keith. He's not my family, he's more than a friend, and I'm sorry. So, long live Keith.
Okay, you probably have never seen me ever, but I live in the East Bay in Oakland. And I met Keith a long time ago. I can't even remember how long ago. But he knew I was a muralist, and I knew he was a photographer. And we just hit it off as just good friends. And so over time, we just hook up now and then, and most often it was a sporting event. He loved to party, so I invited him to my either a Super Bowl party or a Warriors finals party, and he would just fit right in. I mean, have all these people that lived in the East Bay, but he was a natural. So I got to a point where I was doing a project, and I needed a photographer to photograph Richmond, natural elements of Richmond, give me some forests, some creeks, or some trees or rivers, because I was going to etch these things or have a company etch them into elevator doors. So I go, this is the guy for me. I had seen his work, and I loved his work. And then he would show up, and he would just give me a CD, literally a CD, and on it was like maybe 60 photographs, and then another CD with another 60 photographs. And I go, wait a minute, dude, you got to pick some of these things out. I mean, you're the photographer. He goes, well, I just want to be sure you had a lot of choices. And I went to. So anyway, so I wound up having to go through all of these photographs. I mean, a lot of photographs. And found just the right ones that got etched into steel. And so if you're ever in Richmond and their business area or civic area, they have offices there.
Civic Center.
Pardon me?
Civic Center.
The Civic Center, there you go. Thank you, dear. At the Civic Center, and you will see his work, literally, in steel, will be there forever. And he just got a kick out of it. He was so meticulous, right down to his miles and how much I owed him. So he was really meticulous. But anyway, I was happy to pay him for his time and travels, and his work is spectacular. And if there's a couple of photographs from that series that I found on the wall here. There's this beautiful one here with a single tree, and I think that's Mount Time in the background. And then the one on the far end, he also submitted that. But believe me, there was many photographs. And I thank you, Keith, for that. And he would call me up again now and then, or text me or leave me messages about when's the next party. And I go, dude, the Warriors stunk this year, so it's going to be a while. And then the Raiders left the Bay Area, so I go, oh man, we won't be doing any more Super Bowl parties. But he wanted a party, and he wanted to come back and hang out on my side of the bay. And but whenever we got together, it was always fun times. And of course, a few times we'd go over to Deb's house. And his one last thing, we went to visit me. He was hanging out in my studio, and I had this large 4-foot by 4-foot mirror that I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Maybe just stick it on my wall. And he goes, are you going to use that? And I go, well, yeah, eventually, but maybe, I don't know. And he goes, well, can I have it? I go, sure. So sometimes spending time at their house, and I'm walking through the backyard, and there's that big 4-foot by 4-foot mirror just walked up against a tree. Anyway, that's where the mirror wound up. And it seems typical that was just what he would do with it. But anyway, I'll miss Keith. He was a wonderful man and had fun times with him. And Deb, too. Thank you.
Through this eccentric lens that drew out a truth that only he would find. Right? And he was committed to finding those truths, no matter how unorthodox, perplexing, or painful they were. He sought out things below the surface, and he could make them come alive in his photographs because, as someone said, he never left a photo untouched. He was an amazing listener. He was curious, genuine, honest. He was a father to me. You know, he never had children of his own, but as people have said, he had many children whose lives he has profoundly impacted, and I was privileged to be one of them. One of the things is that I was a fairly talkative and imaginative kid, and Keith would always listen. I must have bored him to death, but somehow I didn't. He was genuinely interested. And I think I didn't really understand how important that was to me until I had a child of my own, and my son also had a relationship with Keith, where I could take a hike with them and I wouldn't say a word, because they would just start talking. And I was like, oh, wow. You know, Keith had an exuberance, right? And it was sometimes awkward, and always genuine. When he first met my wife, one of the things he said the day he met her, he said, "Keep this guy, he's going to be rich." I'm still waiting for that moment. And fortunately, my wife Alana took his advice and kept me, and hasn't held me to his promise. In fact, despite a rather awkward meeting, right, first meeting, she even allowed him, as my mom mentioned, to MC at our wedding. And that was who Keith was. No matter how awkward he was, you couldn't help but love him, because it was a genuine love of life and of being larger than life, right? And that's where this weird contradiction that other people mentioned comes in, because he was sometimes so inscrutable and private for such an outgoing person. And I think that's actually a common trait for outgoing people. I'll never forget how I learned that Keith was getting married. He texted me and he said, "Hey, I'm going to fill out a new checkbox on my tax return this year." And I texted him, I said, "What?" I said, "Oh yeah, we got married." When I found out he got married, it was the happiest I had ever seen him, Deb. He was so thrilled. You know, he had been your life partner for so long, and this idea to him that in his 70s, he got to check this new box on his tax return, right? And experience this whole new level of his relationship with you. I mean, he was like a kid in a candy store. He was thrilled. But yeah, I will never forget how he told me about it. It was so Keith, right? Saying something unexpected, funny, and just seeing life through his own lens, which is how he not only took photos, but I think how he lived life in general. I will miss him. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ed Brown. I live at the other end of Sequoia. Sequoia and Scenic, Keith and Deb live at Sequoia and Tamalpais, so we consider ourselves bookends. I've only known Keith since we were bookends. So I moved into the neighborhood in '96. We would go for walks in the morning, and you've all heard the kind of person Keith is. I'm remembering this afternoon how he told me he had been diagnosed with kidney cancer. And I said, "Really? That sounds pretty serious." He said, "Oh, I can have one taken out. You can live with one, you know." Well, as you know, it turned out more serious. I think that may have been the last I saw him. Anyway, in Keith's honor, I wanted to offer a poem. The poem is by a man named William Stafford, who, another one of our stand-in people who passed on, I think 1993. William Stafford is probably most famous for a story of how he was interviewed. He became a conscientious objector in the Second World War, which is pretty unusual. He had grown up in a Mennonite family in Kansas. And while he was a conscientious objector working in camps in the mountains and forests, he began a practice of writing a poem every day. And he said, someone asked him, how do you do that? How can you write a poem every day in and day out? How can you be that creative? And he said, I lower my standards. So here's one of his poems, one of these daily poems. There's a thread, and it applies to Keith, it applies to each of us. But hearing from everyone today, you can hear it in this poem. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to tell them about the thread. But it's hard for others to understand. As long as you follow it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People suffer and die. You get sick and grow old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Thank you, Keith. It's been a joy and a pleasure to know you. All the best.
All the people who spoke, I probably know Keith at least like 30 years. And, I remember having a party at our house. Keith disappeared. This is David's theme. Keith disappears in the middle of the party. People are looking around. Where's Keith? Where's Keith gone? Keith turns up like 45, 50 minutes later. Where you been? I was in my car. What were you doing there? I was listening to a speech by Alan Greenspan. I could read about it in the paper on Monday, but I could just listen to him talk. And so I always enjoyed Keith's intellectual curiosity. Whoever spoke about, you were the high school science teacher, you should know all about like atomic particle theory. Can I ask you a question? That was Keith, so I appreciate that. Another story is David and I were camping with Keith and my young son, who was 2 at the time. We had been out for 3 or 4 days. It's Sunday morning, we're packing up to go home, and Keith wants to know, is there anything left in the cooler to eat? Keith, we have about a half a slab of salmon left. Can I eat that? Well, it's not cooked. That's okay. Keith, it's been in the cooler since Thursday. That's fine. And with his hands, he just grabbed the thing out and ate the salmon. Just wolfed it down. The third story is a little harder for me to tell. David Campbell and Keith came to my house to go skiing. And, it's 5:30 in the morning. We're heading up to Tahoe, and of course, I'm going to be with these guys for the day. 20 minutes into the ride, after the polite chit-chat is over, Keith leans forward from the back seat and he says, Bill, I hear you've been acting like an asshole at home.
Wow.
The reason I want to talk about this is because it's often easy to be a friend when things are going good and the sun's shining and
Yeah.
you find out who your friends are when things aren't going good. When the sun ain't shining and life is tough. Keith didn't say that because he was upset. He wasn't being judgmental. He wasn't being anything other than, dude, we got to talk about this and figure it out. I care deeply about you. I care about your family. And all I want is the best for you and your family at all times. Right? And that was Keith to me. That's why I'm here today. Because I didn't have a lot, you know. I was in the photography crowd through my wife Kelly. I was in the mountain biking, you know, circle, right? But you know, Keith was a really, really special man. And, you know, no matter how long I live, I'll always think about some of the conversations I had with Keith and how he impacted me. So thank you very much. I really appreciate having this chance to talk about it. Thanks.
And to hear all the things people had to say about him. He'd say, God, I never told him anything about myself. They all seem to know me so well. It's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
Fare thee well, oh my honey, fare thee well.